welcome to this webinar from Skills Australia on the development of a new set of scenarios as part of our overall strategy development process. We're very pleased that you could join us this afternoon. In fact, we've got about over 65 people already joined and about 25 looking to join as we move through the afternoon. You'll hear from me, I'm going to be your host, and you'll also hear from Susan Oliver, who is our futurist. My colleague, Dr. Caroline Smith, who is Project Director for this project, will also be available online, as will Rebecca Motta and Paula Buchik from our communications team. We're going to try and make this webinar as interactive as possible, so I'll just ask Rebecca to come in now and just to repeat the instructions about how you can ask a question. Over to you, Rebecca.
Sure. So as Trevor said on the intro, you can type your questions into the Q&A bar on your computer screen and hit submit. Those questions will be answered later on in the presentation by the speakers. They'll be answering those questions aloud. And additionally, you can dial *1 to ask a question over the phone. Telstra will then queue those phone questions, and they will be submitted to us in the order that they're asked. And we also ask that you please identify yourself when asking a question. And we very much encourage questions, so don't hold back. And that's all on that front.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Well, you've seen we've now got the slide up for our agenda for the day. I'll do a brief introduction and then hand over to Susan. In terms of the scenario development, it's really all about us developing our next iteration of the National Workforce Development Strategy. Skills Australia's role in life, as in our Act of Parliament, is to provide advice to the Australian Government on the future workforce development and skill needs of Australia. And in 2010, we issued our first National Development Strategy, Australian Workforce Futures. And in devising that strategy, we used 3 scenarios. In that case, we borrowed 3 scenarios from the Shell company. And those of you who have read our strategy will know that they were called Open Doors, Low Trust Globalisation and Flags. We're now in the process of revising that strategy, and that's the reason why we're going into a new set of scenarios. But this time round, we've decided to actually develop the scenarios from scratch ourselves rather than using another company's. So why are we using scenarios? Well, what we believe is that it's difficult to know the future, and our ability to forecast is somewhat constrained if we're just looking at past trends. And you can only reliably forecast for 3 to 4 years, if that. And it's good for short-term planning, but not for strategic planning. So what we're looking to do is to construct a range of potential futures, so that they can go from one extreme to another, and hopefully that they will represent some models of the future so that we can actually test the system and look at the supply side, for example, so the supply side can be made sufficiently flexible to actually accommodate a range of different potentials. And that's what we're doing at the moment. What we're doing is going through a whole series of data and looking at scenarios, and to have a look so we can test the future and have some different possibilities. As you see there, having alternative futures will help us manage the uncertainty, help address some of the limitations of forecasting, and improve long-term decision making. We will be doing some modelling. Once we've done the scenarios, we will model some of the outcomes that those scenarios might produce, and we'll be using Deloitte Access Economics, who will be working with Caroline, Susan and the team to model the future. And each strategy, each scenario poses a different set of strategic challenges, and we're going to use them to develop and test strategies, understand the risks, and generate new ideas and possible responses. Now, how are we going about building these scenarios? Well, we started off by having a seminar with the Australian Social Sciences Academy. And the outcomes of that seminar are actually recorded in a very interesting paper which was written up by Caroline and our board member Michael Keating under the title of Critical Issues Facing Australia to 2025, which was a summary for our first scenario development forum. and that paper is available on our website. And in it, a number of leading experts looked at some of the potential drivers that might shape some of the scenarios. For example, we had Graham Hugo, the well-known demographer, talking about social, cultural and demographic trends. We had David Gruen, the deputy head of the Australian Treasury, giving talks on economic and financial trends. We had Sue Richardson talking about labour, the workforce and industrial trends. Anthony Arundel on science and innovation. Michael Keating and Glyn Davis, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, on governance and public policy. And obviously sustainability, energy and water is going to be critical in the future. And we had Kerry Schott, who was in the Treasury in New South Wales, but now is the CEO of Sydney Water. So what we did is the first stage of the process. We actually had a look at some of the drivers and identify some of the key driving trends that will help shape our scenarios. At this stage, we engaged Susan and her colleague Peter Hayward as futurists to help shape the scenarios. And Susan is exceptionally well qualified to help us in that. She's a strategic planner and futurist. She was the CEO of the Australian Commission for the Future and also a senior manager of Arthur Andersen Consulting, has also worked in the public sector. She has a range of directorships from the Smith family to Program Maintenance Services Limited to the Coffee International and the Melbourne Chamber Orchestra. So Susan is an expert in the whole science of being a futurist. So with that, having done that introduction, I'm now going to hand over to Susan, and she's going to go through the work that she's been doing in developing the scenarios for Skills Australia to help us inform our next iteration of the National Workforce Development Strategy. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Robin. Good afternoon, everybody. Look forward to having your questions and challenges to what we have. So on the slide in front of you, you've got a graphical representation of our scenarios, and I'm going to talk through each of them, beginning with the long boom. And the long boom, in many respects, is our baseline scenario. So you're in this world today, but what we're doing is taking a punt that it's going to continue into the future. So what's happening today? Critically important is the economic development and the strength of the Chinese economy, and following not far behind it, the Indian economy. And so for some time we've really benefited from the fact that these economies are growing apace. There's a tremendous demand for our resources, and our resources are efficient to produce. We've got some very big global companies in there able to dig it up and ship it off, and because there is a shortage in the face of this enormous demand, we're getting amazing prices for those resources. That has the upside for those companies and for all of our services sector, engineering sector that serves that part of the economy, but it has the downside that the high terms of trade have really had some impact on some sectors that are exposed to that. So you will have read about the impact on overseas students and studying in Australia. You will have read about the impacts on tourism. And so the story, the upside, is this tremendous boom, this tremendous opportunity for Australia, and the thread that runs through it is that it's not good for everybody. As China is developing and India are developing their economies, there's also a lot more interest in what we'd call protein-based food in the and our agriculture sector is also very well able to serve those growing economies. The impacts back in Australia from that has been great, as I said, for food, great for the resources sector, very good for construction. There's a lot of construction activity and bringing a lot of the mining resources on stream as quickly as possible. And also in this scenario, the government is getting some very good returns through taxes, through full employment, and so therefore the government is well positioned to also invest in critical infrastructure, and we've seen that investment in the National Broadband Network. In the scenario we're projecting that continues to meet the needs of growing populations in urban centres. With that growth in population, driven by optimism, so therefore people having more babies, driven by high levels of immigration to provide the jobs that we need in terms of short-term immigrants, and because Australia feels that we attitudinally have every reason to feel optimistic and to accept more immigrants in our country. However, we know that in that downside, with the high terms of trade, not everybody is benefiting. And other aspects are also causing some structural change. Retailing is suffering because we have an ageing population, we have the incursion of online retailing, some very big changes in the way that people wish to shop, and so there's structural adjustment happening in this very high employing sector of the economy, retailing. And ageing of the population, and I won't talk more about that in the other scenarios, but we know that the population of Australia is ageing, along with Germany and many European countries, with Japan, and with China. China is an ageing country because of the one single child policy. So in this scenario, however, because there is work and because our ageing population are healthy and well served by a cashed up government, then these people are very active in the labour market and hang on in their jobs, bringing their skills and their experience into that market. So that is really the scenario that we're thinking about for the long boom. Now we'll move on to the cycle lives on. Perhaps this scenario challenges us a lot because it is true that historically Australia has gone through many boom and bust scenarios, and whether it was riding on the sheep's back or riding on the bounty of our wheat harvest or riding on the back of our minerals, we've done it before. It's always been dig it up and ship it off, and we've done very well. In this scenario, we don't expect that China will continue to grow at the amazing pace that it has, and we're saying, well, China's growing at about 5%. Now that is still a tremendous growth in the economy, but it is certainly a lot less than we've seen and we've come to depend upon. And we're saying in this scenario that the Indian economic growth slows as well. Because our productivity growth is poor and we have new taxes, the carbon tax reduces productivity further and impacts some regions of Australia more severely than others. We also bring into this scenario some of the environmental events which have cost the economy highly and which continue, and just as a fact of life, the Queensland floods were reported to have cost the economy about $9 billion. So this is the sort of impact that can be slowing an economy and pushing the cycle down. The slowdown is also caused by the skills constraints and the economic performance in some of our sectors, which are slowed tremendously by the fact that we do not get the skills that we need to drive the growth in those sectors or those businesses. The underlying cost base for business rises, energy and utility costs rise, and there's bigger impacts, obviously, on some sectors than others from those higher input costs. As a result of the high Australian dollar, manufacturing and tourism sectors lose their markets, and some, if not many, manufacturing activities close. And the poor performance of the stock market and the lowered interest rates reduce returns on savings, and you have a cautious and an ageing population that are saving and not spending, which causes this downturn in retailing and the subsequent loss of jobs. Now, what's challenging about this is what will drive it up, and when it is driven up again, when this cycle comes up, whether we go back to where we are today or whether we can anticipate something very, very different. So we're saying that the swing changes in this world. The upswing began once the Chinese and the Indian economies recovered. So once again, Australia was tied to the fortunes of these very populous countries and their fast developing economies. However, also intrinsically important in this is that Australian governments and our industry leaders provide leadership in achieving productivity gains both in the public and the private sectors. And actually this is one of the new agenda items for the Business Council of Australia. So just how government and the private sector work together to translate the productivity needs into reality, into real operational sense, is one of the challenges, I think, that underlies the upturn in the cycle. But in our world, in this scenario, the world has changed. Technology has changed the nature of work and the number of jobs, and Australia encounters a jobless recovery. Responding to the challenges, both domestically, environmentally, economically and technologically, of huge scale and complexity, China and India have built and matured their own professional services and industrialised manufacturing sectors and have taken the world by storm, and at price points that many developed nations just cannot emulate. And I'll quote there a recent article at the same time as we understand the difficulties that Qantas are facing with their cost structures, and one of the major and fairly new Chinese airlines made a profit of $1 billion last year off the back of very, very low prices, very, very low fares. So we also know that in India they're bringing to market $30 televisions and $10 mobile phones and $300 cars. So there's something very, very different in this future world that we're anticipating, where the price points driven by highly populous countries but relatively low incomes will demand and will be provided for by new ways of manufacturing and bringing these things to market. Also in the new world, after the cycle downturn, and as it turns up, the baby boomer Australians who lost their job in the downturn, they don't feel that they have the confidence or the skills to get back into the workplace, and they are now permanently out of the workplace. The skilled people that we've relied on to provide short-term immigrants to fill many of our jobs are also now well employed in their own countries, and so we also predict in this scenario that where we may have been able to use these skills to buffer our economic cycles, we may find that we're challenged that they have work that they can do it in their own countries and may not wish to come to Australia. So that is the cycle lives on. The third scenario we investigated was, well, what happens if our terms of trade turn down and stay down? And we had to think very hard about what might cause that to happen. We've actually, while you're reading this, we've called this the ship stop heading north, because I was reading a Hugh White article recently in The Age, a letter to The Age, I think, and he was saying, our prosperity depends on the future of a handful of big companies and their immense exports of resources, especially to China. What might make the mines go quiet? The ship stop heading north. Now, Hugh postulates a number of geopolitical issues. Particularly, he says, if there is some sort of severe, I'll call it a standoff, but perhaps a war. He did use the word war in his article, and perhaps I shouldn't laugh, between China and the United States over contested territories such as China's presence in the South China Sea and the skirmishes that they already have with Vietnam and elsewhere, that given our alliance, political alliance with the United States, would the Chinese continue to want to buy their absolutely strategic and critical resources from a country which is absolutely compromised politically because of that relationship with the United States? Now, that may seem extreme, but on the other hand, I've also been talking to somebody who's a bit of an expert in Africa, who said that at the moment in Africa you have a situation where I think, African nations now have stable governments, and these nations in Africa are receiving very significant investment from China in their mining resources. And under Africa, there are as many resources with the same sort of diversity as there is in Australia. So another thing that would stop the ships from heading north would be a bringing into supply worldwide of these resources. And suddenly Australia is just me too in terms of the resources it has for sale. It's still very, very efficient with those same very global and powerful mining companies. However, it's really dig it up and ship it off at fairly low prices, and probably very low prices in this scenario where the competition is so intense. So the Chinese economy is still very strong, the Indian economy is still very strong, but Australia now is not able to sell their resources at anything like the prices that they have done in the past. So what does that mean for Australia? Well, it actually builds back into our equation those currently terms of trade challenge sectors. So our tourism sector should benefit. However, if there's a standoff with China, perhaps we need to be gearing it much more towards India and other Asian nations. Our education sector can benefit, and recently India projected a need for 500 million people to be trained over the next 10 to 12 years. I think it was 12 years was the period of their projection. So the opportunity for education, tertiary education, to be provided from Australia is a very big plus in this scenario. If we consider the strengths and the development of India as an alternative to China, we may still be a lucky country, because there is still a demand for protein-based foods. There's still a real opportunity for our agricultural sector, and there is still very much an opportunity for us to be selling services into that new world. But we are feeling less wealthy. We won't be travelling overseas. Our tourism may be more local, and without the very high returns that we're currently getting from our mining sector, we will not be investing so much in shares or getting such a good dividend from shares, and we may expect that our superannuation returns will turn down. And however, the opportunities are in manufacturing, and we strongly saying that with the opportunities of higher technologies, with the opportunities of new material sciences, then Australia can build back a more complex manufacturing sector in that new world. And finally, Ring of Fire, and I think this is where I thought I was last summer. This is a world in which we paint a picture of an unnervingly volatile world. The geopolitics of our region is fraught with minor skirmishes and contests over resources and territory. World economics remain unstable, and the impacts of often extreme environmental events causes us to be ever vigilant and risk-averse. In this world, there is no place for certainty, and I've quoted in the scenario Voltaire. It's wonderful to be able to find an opportunity to quote Voltaire, where he says, "Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is an absurd one." And in this scenario, we paint that picture. It is a globalised, interconnected and interdependent world with more than 70 countries engaging freely or mostly freely in the global economy. The financial system is truly global in nature. It is complex, it is interwoven, and risks of fallout occur very far from the root cause. And there is no immunity from the financial shocks in this world. It is a very populous and inequitable world with 8 billion people, and there is inequality, poverty, and environmental problems of an enormous scale and complexity. This is the scenario where the issues of our human and our social future play out very large. The pressure is on to find environmental solutions and to address the disastrous impacts of storms, flooding, cyclones and tsunamis on a scale and a severity never before experienced. Large numbers of poorer people in low-lying coastal lands of Asia and the Pacific are dispossessed of their homes, their livelihoods and their communities. And short and long-term solutions are called for, and the international community has to pull together and respond quickly to disasters while trying to build that long-term sustainable future through global solutions, laws and policies. Refugees also feature prominently in this world. Environmental and political refugees flee to safer shores and a new life, and they arrive in large numbers in Australian waters. In this short-term, highly risk-averse scenario, we paint a picture of work and of the economy where our views become more and more short-term, our investment terms become more and more short-term, and we become somewhat phobic about the numbers of immigrants that are arriving on our shore, and we actually lobby governments and say, well, no, that's too many. And so perhaps one of the worst outcomes of this scenario could be a zero growth or low growth economy and depleting population base. It is very challenging to think for business where we've always aimed for growth. Strategies will be about growth, to think about addressing a low growth or a no growth future, and that could well be one of the challenges in this scenario. Importantly also, government budgets are poor as the resource sector winds back and the tax bases reduce. A frightened electorate is not ready for reform, so tax reforms and any visionary acts by government do not win voter confidence and trust, and therefore a government that has a pattern of investing in what we might call middle-class welfare really can't pull back from that, and this leads to budget blowout, reinforcing the conviction of the population that government is not to be trusted. So in this weakened position, government plans with short-time horizons and immediate hip-pocket policies. There is no big-picture planning and now no ground-breaking policies, even at a time when breakthrough and innovative thinking is needed to solve these seemingly intractable problems. This may sound like a very, very depressed place to be, but in fact it certainly is a challenging future, and in the workshops that we ran we found that the responses of the workshop participants were very, very much more aggressive and strategic than they were in some of the others where we perhaps can be lulled into a feeling of complacency. So that's the 4 scenarios, so I look forward to hearing your views on them.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. It's Robin Shreeve here again. I'll just ask Rebecca just to repeat how people can ask a question, and then we'll get over to the questions and further comment. Rebecca, would you just like to remind us?
Yeah, sure. So everyone should be seeing on their screen a little box where they can type in questions. We encourage you to go ahead and type those in because they pop up immediately on our screens and we can then answer them aloud. Alternatively, you can hit *1 on your phone and then ask the question over the phone via Telstra. Telstra will queue them up and they'll be brought to us in the order that they're asked. So choose either of those options. If you're having to queue on the phone with Telstra, feel free to type it in and we can get it immediately.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. And just having a look at the 4 scenarios, as Susan said, some of the workshops were, really interesting. And when we got to Ring of Fire, we thought that was, quite a difficult scenario. But some of the participants were also working on some scenarios in a different context, and they said they thought we were quite mild because we hadn't got plague and pestilence and forms of SARS coming in as well. So it's all there. Can I ask Telstra? Have we got any verbal questions online?
There are no questions at this point.
Okay, I've got a number of questions up on my screen here, and I've got a question from Nathan, and Nathan's question is, in the third scenario, it was suggested that Africa becomes a competitor in the supply of resource commodities. Would Australian mining companies be best positioned to exploit these resources, and would that somewhat mitigate the loss to Australian workforce skills and industry investors? So it's really the question that if there are lots of minerals in Africa, as we know, could Australia still benefit by using its expertise in both helping to exploit those mineral resources and training? Susan or Caroline, would you like to respond to Nathan's question?
I'm happy to, Robin. It's Susan speaking. I think that our major companies probably are to some extent, but they will be exploiting those African resources with African labour, not Australian, although you would expect that there would be some professional services and expertise that would be involved in that. But we're talking about a scale here that's very, very large, and the size of Chinese investment into those countries is really significant. And the Chinese are clearly, their strategy is, we're paying too much for all of this. If we bring more of it on stream, we can pay less and we can be part of the ownership of it. And so they have a very aggressive strategy of investing around the world in strategic resources. There's some good literature if you go onto the web at the moment, and you'll see that there's a view that this is going to do more in terms of pulling people out of poverty than any overseas aid has ever done. And if the numbers of people in China, just as an example, who have come out of poverty because of economic development, far exceeds anything that could have been ever achieved under a sort of overseas aid or poverty program. So this is seen as being a very strategic and important development of Africa by the governments there, and it is of enormous scale.
We've got a few more online questions coming in, but keep them coming in. We've got a question from Christopher Vass, who's at the ANU, and Christopher asks, how will the process backcast to test the robustness of the current policy settings? So we might, Caroline or Susan, would you like to respond to that?
I'll come in on this one. I mean, I think we're starting to, thanks for the question, Christopher, looking at the next steps around the work that we're doing, and Robin will touch on that further shortly. But basically what we're going to be doing, we're building the scenarios first, and then we're going to be looking at the implications of the scenarios for the supply and demand for skills out to 2025. And we're going to be feeding that into the modelling, as Robin's explained. Part of what we're also considering at the moment really is how we can potentially use what we're calling either a normative or an aspirational scenario to kind of look at where it is that we want to be in 2025, and in those in the eventuality of any of those different scenarios, how we can actually be best placed to get there. So this piece of work is really part of I guess a much bigger piece of work that we'll be doing, looking at in developing a workforce development strategy for Australia out to 2025. And so that will bring together a whole range of sort of different aspects, and obviously we'll be looking at where we are presently in order to be also considering where we need to be in the future.
I've got another question here from Philip Chan, and Philip asks, any insights into the differing implications to states and territories of any scenarios you'd like to talk about? So is there a state and territory perspective of any of the scenarios?
Well, in many, strangely enough, I guess, if the ships stop heading north, it gives a much better allocation of jobs and industry activity back towards the east. Certainly the long boom is very much, in terms of wealth generation, is very much favouring the west and the north of Australia. Although we do say that the nature of manufacturing will change, so it may not be those sort of heavy industry chimney types of manufacturing activities, but I would say that certainly as manufacturing recovers, it would be back into urban centres. In all of these, unless you just write off what seems to be the change of Eastern diets to some of our Western habits, the agriculture sector seems to be pretty consistently a winner in all of these scenarios. So that's got a very good regional impact. So environmental, I guess, as carbon tax is introduced, that certainly has impacts regionally, in some regions more than others. So yes, it's a good question, and we do explore it to some extent, although probably not with the granularity that your question may be suggesting.
I've got a couple more questions coming on the email, but can I just cast to Telstra to ask, is there anybody hanging on the line with a question?
There are no questions.
Okay, we'll keep going then. I've got a question here, I think from Gillian Danielson, which is from Michael from the Logistics Training Council. Mention was made on the impact on baby boomers. Any comments in terms of the younger cohorts, Generation X, Y, and now Z?
Look, I think probably there is an answer in here. The reason I talk a lot about the baby boomers is not just because I'm one of them, but because it is such a demographic impact on our economy and the demand for goods and services, the impacts on urban planning and public transport and health demands and expectations. So it's not meant to be weighted there just because it is just yet another demographic, but just because that ageing impact is so significant. Clearly the issue is availability of skilled jobs and unskilled jobs, and we know that even for young people as students there's a reliance on retailing and hospitality and tourism jobs. So we do talk about sectors where you would expect impacts on younger people. Caroline, do you want to add anything to that? No.
Okay, I've got another question here from Stephen Seymour, and Stephen asked, worldwide there's a shortage of skills. How does the scenario planning factor in skills mobility across borders with the global context? Canada has skill shortages, as does Mongolia, Chile and Australia. Just before you answer, I just might put a comment into Stephen's question. If anybody's read The Global Auction by Hugh Lauder and colleagues, which is looking at the globalisation of the workforce, Lauder and his colleagues point out that the output of Chinese, Indian and Russian universities now outstrips the output of the whole of Western Europe and North America combined. And what's more, those universities have far more students studying science, engineering and medicine, the STEM subjects, than we do. So I think there's certainly a global shift, and Lauder's book does argue the fact that lots of the high quality design work, not just manufacturing, will shift from the west to the east. But the question is, skill shortage is a worldwide phenomena. How do the scenarios play out? Over to you, Susan and Caroline.
It's pretty important in these scenarios. We talk about short-term or temporary immigration as in terms of immigration into Australia, in terms of that mobility of people into Australia, and also recognising that internally we have very poor, very low mobility between east to west of the country or to the north of the country. And so we write about immigration, both permanent and short-term, in all of the scenarios and look at what would impact greater or lesser interest of people to come here and greater or lesser interest of those people to stay in their own homes and in their home countries and serve the economies there. We also look to some extent at where Australians would be encouraged to leave and find work elsewhere. And in any downturn where other economies are doing very well, then we would expect that particularly skilled people would be heading out of the country. But if there's any other references you want to give us or material that gives us further information, I'd be very happy to receive it.
We've got some more questions coming in, but we've got the scope for more, and we've got one here from Michael Mackay from the South Australian Training and Skills Commission East. And Michael asks, which of the scenarios will be modelled by Access Economics? Also, can you elaborate on the overseas migration levels within the scenarios?
I understand all of the scenarios are going to be modelled by Access Economics. We just don't expect that all of the factors that we've taken into account in the scenarios will be able to be accommodated by the modelling. So what we actually have in this project is a symbiotic relationship between scenarios and modelling rather than a total sort of snap in terms of the match. So that's correct, Caroline? Yeah. The second part of the question, sorry?
It was about the differential impacts on overseas migration in each of the different scenarios. Maybe, you know, if you could run through that, Susan.
Yes, so in the long boom, we expect very high levels of immigration and very high levels of temporary migration, 457 visas, driven by the skills shortage and driven by the amount of economic activity and the fullness of employment in the economy. In the cycle lives on, in the downturn, we see a downturn in the numbers of immigrants in general as the attitude to it from the electorate says, gee, we can't find a job, why are we bringing in more people? And then as the economy turns up, we would see some upturn in that. In the ship stop heading north, I'm trying to think whether we had a specific issue on migration there, but just while I gather my thoughts, in the final one, the Ring of Fire, we saw that attitudinally Australians said, no, we don't want all of these people coming into the country, and in fact what happens then is our rate of population growth, if you like, stagnates and goes below replacement.
I've got another question here, and it's coming from Di Booker. She's saying the scenarios focus on the impact of Asia and Africa. Given the impact the European financial affairs are having on the world currently, do you see any impact from that part of the world as well? Or is it now that we've cut our ties with Europe so the contagion might not spread?
I think we'd all wish the contagion wouldn't spread. We have, I haven't written this large in the scenarios, but we have said that the issues of Europe do continue, particularly in Ring of Fire. We say, well, it actually just continues to be a reason why one day the share market might dip and then the next week it might come back and so on. In our scenario planning, however, we do say that the US recovers slowly, but it does recover, whereas the problems in Europe seem to be more fundamental and probably have a much longer tail than some might have imagined or hoped.
Yeah, we've got a related question in the sense of concentrating on Asia. The scenario, this is from Sue Beats, the scenarios concentrate heavily on the resources sector, which, though it's about over 50% of our export value and double-digit proportion of our GDP, is still only 2% of employment, and it's probably not going to get way beyond that. Are there other sectors of the economy we might want to play a bit more in terms of employment than resources?
The resources is really a driver in terms of the economics of the nation rather than the employment opportunities of the nation. And the economics of the nation and how much money government has is collecting particularly, is another key outfall from that. There are a number of service sector jobs that are quite highly specialised and technical, which serve the mining sector. So because they're in the science technology area, I think are important. Agriculture, I think I've already said that, plays out strongly in all of them, but in the Ring of Fire we might expect that there would be environmental impacts on our own capability to produce, so we wouldn't just have a really safe, secure supply of food. There would be problems with flooding and fires and that sort of thing. We talk about retailing across all of the scenarios in different ways. We talk about the impacts of an ageing population on care, on aged care, on community care and on health care, and a number of related jobs and opportunities that come out of the ageing population and the different ways that that will drive consumption patterns, whether it's retrofitting public buildings and public access, whether it's redesigning some of our urban forms. That's certainly part of it. And in the long boom, we talk about the construction sector. So there are quite a number of sectors that have very logical implications within the scenarios, and I think that they're discussed quite well.
Got a question here from Ben Barden, the skill set. Ben asks, we currently focus on the skills we need for prosperity. I suppose that's emphasis on economic prosperity. And Ben asks, what do the scenarios tell us about the skills we might need for Treasury's wider notion of well-being? I mean, I might just add something. If, besides the global auction, the other book I've just read is Linda Grattan's The Shift, which is about the future of work. And in that, Linda argues that Generation X and Y are going to be more concerned about variety and the quality of work than maybe climbing up the greasy pole in big bureaucracies that might not still exist. But Ben's asking about the notion of well-being as a factor that might play out more in the future.
I guess that just talks about the nature of work as well as where people might be spending their time outside of work, and also their own personal values and resilience in the face of change and in the face of challenge. I don't think that the scenarios tell you much about that, but that's something that we can look at. I think in all cases you would expect that as you see these changing and challenging worlds, that personal resilience and sufficient understanding of that complexity to not feel overwhelmed by it, but to actually engage in it is probably one of the impacts that we can think about. But remember, in writing these scenarios, what we're doing is writing in the first instance the challenges, and from that then the Secretariat and their wider community will say, well, what should we do in response to these challenges? And one of the responses would be to look at the personal capabilities of people in the face of these challenges.
Okay, we've got a question here from Ronaldo Pinada. I hope I've pronounced your name right, Ronaldo, from Tafe, New South Wales. And Ronaldo wanted to ask if there would be any additional challenges that we may not have discussed, given the fact the carbon tax has just been improved, and is it going to affect our trading overseas? So I suppose it's really saying, what benefits have we factored in from the carbon tax in terms of some of the longer term impacts in the different scenarios?
In the view of the future, where we look at technologies and where we look at the challenges within each of these different scenarios, we do look at the jobs. It may be called green jobs. We do look at the sorts of jobs that get created as a result of Australia moving to a more leading position around some of the environmental legislation and awareness. We are also very cognizant of the fact that it does impose an additional cost, and that though that cost as an input to some business will be prohibitive, but hopefully, and this is again we've reflected in the scenarios, that it will generate a need to innovate and to change our production models and to change and look for alternative energy sources or input sources Am I getting to that question?
Yeah, I think, and it's also, I suppose, about we really should talk about a price on carbon and how that's played out in terms of reducing carbon emissions and having a positive impact on our economy from the fact that, we're both leading edge and going to do, limit some of the damage from the overproduction of CO2.
Well, I think it's very important. In scenario 1, we write this, in scenario 2, industry doesn't just lay down and die. Yes, it may locate somewhere else if there's a lower skill base or better legislative environment or whatever else. But on the whole, industry business will find ways of adapting or innovating. And so all of the challenges in these scenarios, we would expect to see a response which is about innovation and about new models. And there's models around the world that are showing how inputs can be changed. The waste from one facility can be a resource input to another. Materials and products can be designed to be lower weight, to be alternative, to be recycling materials. So that's certainly in each of the scenarios in a slightly different way.
So another topical question here again from Christopher Vass at ANU is that Christopher comments that Treasury's intergenerational report suggests that by 2050 government will be spending 27% of GDP as compared to the current 22% on health, aged care and related services. From a workforce perspective, it would be useful to have some focus on this sector. So I suppose I'd just ask Caroline and Susan, how have we built the ageing of the workforce in and the necessary response in terms of a greater proportion of GDP playing out in the scenarios?
That's my preoccupation with this aged baby boomers, Robin. It's there and it's very much recognised. It's both a cost to the economy. It's also a real challenge to government, and in the scenarios where government has money, which is the long boom, and in the cycle lives on, we've said, well, here the government has to provide leadership around productivity, and faced with that enormous looming cost of health as well as aged care, but health, the government responds. So in the cycle lives on, the government shows tremendous leadership. It introduces productivity gains across its major public sector spending areas such as health, education, transport and energy, in partnership with the private sector where they're operating in those sectors. And in health, we know that the productivity gains from an electronic health record, from e-health in its many formats, are not just possible, but essential. So that's one of the responses. We also see opportunities because in the long boom we've got cashed up baby boomers, they're still working, they can spend on health, so the private sector has a big opportunity to deliver. And in the other scenarios where the baby boomers are not so well cashed up, then you've got that impost in government. So it's well and truly there, and with differing looks and feels across the scenarios. But I'm really a bit revved up about the cycle lives on and seeing government taking a leadership role in the productivity potential from public sector activities.
Thank you. I'll just ask you...
Caroline's just got something to add here.
Yeah.
Just to say quickly that Susan really has put a lot of work into this particular area, and has really drilled down into, for example, looking at the aspirations of the baby boomers and their expectations around types of care and what that will have, the implications of that structurally, and then obviously the knock-on impacts of demand for skills will be something that we'll be looking at.
And commercial opportunities, and yep.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes. I might just ask Telstra, finally, did anybody ring in?
No, there are no further questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's our first webinar, so it's been an interesting learning experience that people prefer to email in rather than ring in. So we'll take that into account. Look, can I thank Susan, Caroline and the team for their contributions, and I'll just talk about the next steps. Well, there you have it. We're honing in on 4 scenarios, 4 potential versions of the future, which we will model. We will model with access economics, and we will have a look at some of the quantifiables in terms of what the workforce development and skill needs, some of the skill stockpiles, and in which areas they may need to play out of each of those four potential futures. And obviously they're potential futures. They might not happen, or they might happen at different times and in different places, and there might be a mixture of the four. But what we're looking to do is trying as much as possible to future-proof our planning so that we can actually take account for a range of possible contingencies rather than plan in a detailed way for a future that might never happen. In terms of the next steps, we're currently in the process of sharing and discussing the scenarios, and if colleagues want to give us some further information or express further comment, we'd be delighted to have that. We're going to have a look at the education and training implications of the scenarios. Deloitte Access will shortly start the modelling process, and we always make all our information available at the appropriate time. We will then finalise the scenarios and do some further testing, and then we'll finalise the modelling and the consultation, and we're looking to release a new workforce development strategy in 2012. So the previous scenarios will be replaced by the four that we're developing here. Just to remind people that if you want to look at some of the background drivers, we do have that publication available from our website called Critical Issues Facing Australia to 2025, the summary of the Scenario Development Forum, edited by Michael Keating and Caroline Smith. And if you want some light reading, I'd certainly recommend that you read The Global Auction and Linda Grattan's The Shift, because they're also very future focused. Always pleased to have feedback. Thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon. There's our website, and you can also follow Skills Australia on Twitter. And we look forward to this being the first of many dissemination exercises on this particular project and webinars on future topics with Skills Australia. Thank you for your participation, and have a good weekend.